There is a specific kind of soldier that every garrison produces exactly one of. Not the best, not the worst, not the one who breaks records or gets broken by them. The one who exists in the comfortable, unremarkable middle, competent enough to avoid trouble, present enough to occasionally stumble into it, and somehow, through no particular fault of his own, surrounded by people who cannot tell a story straight. Catterick Garrison produced Dennis Faulkner. And Catterick Garrison, for reasons that will become clear, was never quite able to agree on what Dennis Faulkner actually did. I need to be precise about this. Dennis was not a fraud. He was not manufacturing legend. He was not the kind of man who embellished his own stories in the mess hall, leaning back in his chair and letting the numbers grow. He was, if anything, the opposite, a man constitutionally incapable of making himself sound impressive, who had the remarkable misfortune of being surrounded by people who were constitutionally incapable of letting him sound ordinary. What Dennis did, and what got reported about what Dennis did, were two separate events that happened to share a location. The gap between them was, at all times, exactly 1 degree. Not 2 degrees, not 5, 1. Just enough that no one could call it a lie. Just enough that Dennis, hearing the reported version, would go slightly still in the way a man goes still when he's trying to work out whether he's being made fun of or genuinely misremembered. He was never sure. That uncertainty, it turns out, is the engine of a very specific kind of legend. I was Dennis's bunkmate for 14 months at Catterick. I was also, for a period of roughly 8 of those months, his most reliable deflator. I say deflator. Dennis would say I was the only honest man in the garrison. His sergeant, a man named Howell who had the neck of a retired prop forward and the memory of a selective goldfish, would say I was a chronic underminer with no respect for institutional morale. I say I just told people what actually happened. The problem was that nobody wanted what actually happened. What actually happened was always slightly less. It started with the dog. There is a dog that lives near the eastern perimeter of Catterick, or there was during our time. A large, directionless Labrador of uncertain ownership who had developed a habit of wandering onto the base through a gap in the fence that everyone knew about and nobody had fixed because fixing it would require paperwork, and the dog, frankly, seemed harmless. Dennis was on perimeter duty. The dog got in. Dennis spent approximately 4 minutes redirecting the dog back through the gap, which involved crouching down, making the sort of noises humans make at dogs, and eventually just walking slowly toward it until it reversed back through the fence of its own accord. This is what happened. What Corporal Yates reported at dinner. Dennis had intercepted an unauthorized animal incursion on the eastern perimeter, pursued the animal across approximately 200 meters of restricted ground, and personally escorted it off base without disrupting the duty rotation. 200 meters. Dennis had walked at most 30 feet. The dog had done most of the work. I pointed this out to Yates. Yates looked at me the way people look at someone who has just corrected the calorie count at a birthday party. He still got it out, Yates said. The dog got itself out, I said. Under Dennis's guidance, Yates said, and turned back to his food with the finality of a man who considered the matter closed. Dennis, sitting across from us, stared at his tray. 200 meters, he said quietly to no one. Give or take, said Yates. The thing about the dog incident is that it would have ended there. A small inflation, a rounding up, entirely forgivable, the kind of thing that happens to every story that passes through more than 2 mouths. But then Sergeant Howell heard about it. Howell did not hear about it from Yates. He heard about it from Private Marsh, who heard about it from Yates, which meant it had passed through one additional set of hands and picked up approximately 30% more detail in transit. By the time it reached Howell, Dennis had not merely redirected the dog. Dennis had identified the fence breach, assessed the animal for threat level, coordinated a response that kept the duty rotation clean, and demonstrated the kind of perimeter awareness that Howell found, quote, bloody encouraging in a junior corporal. Dennis found out about this commendation secondhand. He came and sat next to me in the mess hall with the expression of a man who has just been told his car passed its MOT, and then shown a report describing a vehicle in significantly better condition than the one he owns. Howell shook my hand, Dennis said. For the dog, for my perimeter awareness. I looked at him. I crouched down and made noises at a Labrador, Dennis said. That tracks with what I saw. He called it threat assessment. Did you correct him? Dennis was quiet for a moment. He shook my hand, he said again. He's never shaken my hand. I understood then. I understood, and I want to be precise about this, that the machinery had started. That somewhere in the space between what Dennis did and what Howell had been told Dennis did, a process had begun that neither of them had chosen, and neither of them could now easily stop. The gap was 1 degree. The hand had been shaken. The dog was already legend. The road incident happened 3 weeks later, and I was present for all of it, which means I can report with forensic confidence exactly how wide the gap was on that one. Catterick in November is an argument against the existence of a benevolent God. The roads that run along the interior of the base develop a quality in the early morning that can only be described as aspirationally icy. Not quite frozen, not quite wet, existing in a third state of matter that British weather produces specifically to humble people who thought they knew how to walk. Dennis was crossing from the accommodation blocks to the main duty building at 6:15. I was 12 feet behind him, close enough to see everything. A private, young lad named Coates, 3 weeks in, still walking with that slightly bewildered quality that new soldiers carry before the garrison breaks it out of them, hit the icy patch at full stride and went sideways in the specific way that humans go sideways on ice, which is to say, committed, airborne, and briefly optimistic about the outcome before gravity makes its position clear. Dennis caught him. Not dramatically, not by lunging or diving or exhibiting any particular athleticism. Dennis was simply in the right place, put his arm out, and Coates grabbed it and recovered his footing. The whole thing lasted 2 seconds. Dennis said, "All right." Coates said, "Cheers." They both kept walking. This is what happened. I watched it happen. Here is what was reported to Sergeant Howell by Private Coates, who was 19 years old and clearly in the market for a story. Dennis had, in low visibility and on compromised terrain, identified a hazard in his operational environment, executed a rapid response to prevent a fellow soldier from sustaining a potential injury, checked the casualty, and continued his duty without disruption. Low visibility. It was 6:15 in November, yes, but there were lights. There were functioning, operational, electric lights. I was standing 12 feet away and I could see everything perfectly well. Coates had written the report in that particular register that young soldiers develop when they want to sound like the documents they've been made to read. Every word technically accurate. Every word doing work it had not been asked to do. Dennis received this information at 1400 hours when Howell stopped him in the corridor and mentioned, with genuine approval, that he'd heard about the preventative intervention at 0615. Dennis stood there. Preventative intervention, Dennis said to me later. Coates filed a thing, I said. I put my arm out. On compromised terrain. It was a bit slippery. In low visibility. Dennis looked at me for a long time. It was a bit slippery, he said again, but quieter now, like a man trying to hold onto the original shape of something he can feel changing. I should tell you about Lance Corporal Webb, because Webb is important. Webb was the garrison's primary story distributor, a function he performed not out of malice, but out of genuine enthusiasm for the social life of information. Webb liked knowing things, and he liked things being known. He was not a gossip in the pejorative sense. He was more like infrastructure. Stories passed through Webb the way water passes through pipes, faster, under more pressure, and arriving at the destination slightly warmer than when they left. Webb had heard the dog story from Yeats. He had heard the road story from Coates. And Webb, unlike me, was not a deflator. Webb was, constitutionally, an inflator not by calculation, but because his brain genuinely processed events at a slight premium to their actual market value. When Webb told a story, the gap was still 1 degree, but it was 1 degree on top of whatever degree Yeats or Coates had already added. Which meant that by the time a story passed through the original witness, then through the first reteller, then through Webb, Dennis's actual actions were sitting approximately 3 degrees below the version circulating the garrison. 3 degrees is the distance between competent and remarkable. 3 degrees is where legends live. The training exercise. November, deep end of it now. The kind of cold that makes the garrison feel like it was designed by someone who considered suffering a character-building feature rather than a design flaw. The exercise was a standard navigation and communication drill. Pairs of soldiers, radios, grid references, the particular misery of being cold and slightly lost in a field that looks identical in all 4 directions. Dennis was paired with Private Ellis, who was 22, excellent at navigation, and unfortunately prone to the kind of panicked radio communication that made routine difficulties sound like operational emergencies. What happened? Ellis misread a grid reference. They went the wrong direction for approximately 8 minutes. Dennis identified the error by checking his own map, communicated the correction to Ellis, and they rerouted and completed the exercise within the acceptable time window. There was no drama. There was no danger. There was a minor navigational error, a correction, and a completed exercise. What Ellis reported on the radio during the 8 minutes they were off course, in a voice pitched at a frequency that suggested impending catastrophe. We're off grid, Faulkner's assessing, Faulkner's navigating, Faulkner's got it. 3 times, Faulkner's got it. Into a radio that every pair in the exercise could hear. Into a radio that the supervising officers were monitoring. Into a radio that Webb, completing his own exercise 2 fields over, was absolutely listening to. By the time Dennis and Ellis walked back into the assembly point, on time, exercise complete, the phrase had already started its journey. Faulkner's got it. It's a nothing phrase. It means, the other person is handling the navigation error I caused. It means, we're fine, give us a minute. In Ellis's panicked register, it had come out sounding like a man describing his last hope in a deteriorating situation. The supervising officer, a lieutenant named Carver who had been listening to the radio and whose face, when Dennis arrived at the assembly point, carried the specific expression of a man who has been genuinely concerned and is now recalibrating, shook Dennis's hand. Good work out there, Corporal. Dennis looked at his completed exercise sheet. We got a bit turned around, sir. You kept it together, Carver said. Dennis opened his mouth. Closed it. Thank you, sir, Dennis said. He came and sat next to me at the debrief. Ellis panicked on the radio, he said. I heard, I said. We were off by 8 minutes. You were off by 8 minutes, I confirmed. Carver called it keeping it together. You did keep it together. I read a map. Under pressure. There was no pressure. Ellis was the one panicking. I was just reading a map. I looked at him. Dennis, I said, you were the calm one while someone else panicked. That is technically keeping it together. Dennis thought about this. I suppose, he said, in the tone of a man who had just been told his drawing of a house was actually a sophisticated architectural sketch, and wasn't sure whether to be flattered or confused. Webb got hold of the radio story within the hour. By dinner, it had acquired a detail. The 8 minutes had become a significant period, and the navigational error had become compromised conditions. By the following morning, Howell had heard a version in which Dennis had taken command of a deteriorating exercise situation and brought it back on track through decisive navigation and clear-headed communication under pressure. I was present when Howell said this to Dennis in the corridor. Dennis's face did a thing. It was a very specific thing. The face of a man who knows the exact dimensions of what actually happened and is being asked to stand next to a description of something larger and accept that they are the same shape. A small, private reckoning. A moment where the honest response and the convenient response stand at exactly the same distance from his mouth, and he has to choose between them. Dennis said, "Thank you, Sergeant." Later in the mess hall, I asked him why he hadn't corrected it. He was quiet for a while. Howell shook my hand again, he said. "That's twice now." "3 times, Dennis said, counting the dog. He looked at his food. "Ellis really did panic," he said. "On the radio, I really did just read the map and stay calm." "You did," I said. "That's not nothing." "No," I said, "it's not nothing. It's just also not what Howell thinks it is." "No," I said, "it's not that either." Dennis nodded slowly, eating, thinking. The gap, I realized, was not shrinking. The civilian incident happened on a Tuesday, which is the right day for the thing that changes everything to happen, because Tuesday has no drama of its own and borrows it freely. Dennis was off duty in the small commercial strip outside the garrison gate, a row of shops that exist specifically to serve soldiers who need things that the taffy doesn't stock and have 40 minutes to get them. Newsagent, pharmacy, a sandwich place with a chalkboard menu that always listed one more option than it actually had available. An elderly woman, Dennis described her as somewhere between 70 and the concept of permanence, had slipped on the step outside the pharmacy, not badly. She had gone down onto one knee and was in the process of trying to reassemble her dignity when Dennis, who had been 3 feet away buying a newspaper, helped her up, checked she wasn't hurt, picked up the items that had fallen from her bag, and waited with her for approximately 5 minutes until she confirmed she was fine and didn't need anything further. 5 minutes, a helping hand. The items retrieved were a prescription bag and a packet of digestive biscuits. Dennis told me this that evening in the flat register he used for things he considered unremarkable. Cup of tea, helped a woman up, came home. He did not report it. It did not occur to him to report it. It was a thing a human being does when another human being falls near them. It required no reporting. The woman, however, had a nephew. The nephew was in the army, not at Catterick, posted elsewhere, but connected enough to the garrison's social network that, when his aunt called him that evening to mention that a very kind soldier had helped her outside the pharmacy, and when she described the uniform, and when the nephew asked around, the name Dennis Faulkner surfaced within 48 hours. The nephew mentioned it to someone at Catterick. That someone was Webb. Webb, who had the dog, who had the road, who had the exercise, who had been quietly assembling across 14 months a portrait of Dennis Faulkner that was 3 degrees more impressive than the man who went slightly still whenever he heard it. Webb received the pharmacy story and did what Webb always did. He told it. He told it at the precise degree of inflation that his brain applied to everything, automatically, genuinely, without malice. The 5 minutes became he stayed with her. The prescription bag and the digestives became her shopping. The step outside the pharmacy became she took a fall. By the time it reached Howell, an elderly civilian had taken a fall near the garrison gate, and Dennis Faulkner, off duty, had rendered assistance, ensured her safety, and remained with her until she was stable. She told him she was fine and he'd walked home. Howell did not shake Dennis's hand this time. Howell told Lieutenant Carver. Carver told the co. I want to tell you what it looked like when Dennis was called in. He came out of the co's office with the expression of a man who has been handed a trophy for a race he did not know he was running and has only just realized, holding it, that the race was real. He found me, he sat down, he was quiet for a long time. They're putting me in for a commendation, he said. For the woman outside the pharmacy. For all of it, the dog, the road, the exercise, the woman, he paused. They called it a pattern of conduct. A pattern of conduct. I looked at him. Dennis, I said carefully, what did you actually do, all of it? What did you actually do? He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, in the way that he always thought about things, honestly, without performance, without the inflation that everyone else seemed to apply automatically. I redirected a dog, he said. I put my arm out when a lad slipped. I read a map when Ellis panicked. I helped a woman up and waited until she said she was all right. Silence. That's it, he said. Yes, I said. More silence. That's not nothing, he said. And there it was. The same thing he'd said in the mess hall after the exercise. The same quiet, honest assessment of a man who knew the exact dimensions of what he'd done and was trying to work out, with genuine uncertainty, whether the gap between those dimensions and what everyone else was calling them was a distortion or a revelation. I thought about the dog. I thought about Coates on the ice. I thought about Ellis's voice on the radio. Faulkner's got it. I thought about an elderly woman outside a pharmacy and a nephew and Webb and 14 months of 1-degree inflation stacking quietly on top of each other. No, I said, it's not nothing. It's just not. I know what it's not. Dennis nodded. They want me to stand up in front of the regiment, he said. I know. And receive it. Yes. Knowing what I actually did. Yes. He was quiet for a very long time. Is it lying, he said. If I stand there and accept it, is that lying? This is the question I have thought about more than any other question from my time at Catterick. More than tactical questions. More than questions about leadership or conduct or the nature of duty. Is it lying? If you stand there and accept the version of yourself that other people have built from the true materials of your actual actions, inflated by 1 degree at each pass, assembled by people who were not being dishonest, but simply could not help making things slightly more than they were. If you stand there and let that version be formally recognized, while knowing the original dimensions of each component, is that lying? I don't think it's lying, I said. What is it then? It's just reputation, I said. Reputation is just memory with ambition. Dennis stood up in front of the regiment on a Thursday morning in December. Cold. The kind of cold that Catterick produces specifically for formal occasions, as if the garrison itself is determined that no moment of ceremony should be physically comfortable. The parade ground. The full assembly. Howell in the front row with the neck of a retired prop forward, and for the first time in my memory, an expression of uncomplicated pride. The co read the commendation. It described a soldier who had demonstrated consistent and selfless conduct across multiple incidents. A pattern of presence, of calm, of practical assistance, rendered without hesitation or expectation of recognition. Every word was technically accurate. Every word was 3 degrees above what Dennis remembered. I watched his face while it was being read, the slight stillness, the private reckoning, the familiar expression of a man standing next to a description of something larger than himself and trying to work out if they are the same shape. And then something happened that I did not expect. Dennis stopped calculating. I saw it happen. It was a small thing, a shift somewhere around the eyes, a decision made quietly and without announcement. He stopped measuring the gap. He stopped running the comparison. He stood up straight in the December cold in front of his regiment, and he just received it. Not the dog story, not the road story, not the exercise, not the pharmacy. The pattern, the actual pattern, which was, when you assembled it honestly, a man who was always present, always calm, always more concerned with the person near him than with how the moment would read. A man who redirected a dog without fuss, who put his arm out without thinking, who read a map while someone else panicked, who stayed with an old woman until she said she was all right. None of those things individually were remarkable. Together across 14 months, without intention, without performance, they were a pattern of conduct. The Co finished reading. The garrison applauded. Dennis shook the Co's hand. I watched him do it, and I thought, the gap is still there. It will always be there. He will always know the original dimensions, and the reported dimensions are always going to be 1 degree more. But here is what I also thought. The reported dimensions are built from real materials. Every single one of them is built from something Dennis actually did. The inflation is real. The foundation is also real. And maybe that is the precise definition of reputation. Not a lie, not the truth, but the truth as filtered through the people who were there and could not quite help making it slightly more than it was, because something in what they saw made them want it to be slightly more. Dennis Faulkner did not become a legend because he did legendary things. Dennis Faulkner became a legend because he consistently did small things correctly, in the presence of people who loved him slightly more than they loved accuracy. The mess hall that evening. Dennis came in and sat down across from me with his tray, and the commendation paperwork folded in his breast pocket, and the expression of a man who has had a complicated day and would like some chips and not to discuss it. We ate. Across the room, I could hear Webb. Webb, who had been at the parade, who had seen the commendation read, who had now been handed the formal, official, co-endorsed version of the Dennis Faulkner story, and was already, naturally, in the process of improving it. Not just the woman outside the pharmacy. He's been doing this the whole time he's been here. There was the thing with the dog at the eastern perimeter. Full pursuit, couple 100 meters. Dennis went very still. I watched him. He picked up his fork. 200 meters, he said quietly. Give or take, I said. He ate a chip. Across the room, Webb was still going. The garrison was still listening. The story was still growing, 1 degree at a time, in the hands of people who had been there and couldn't help it. Dennis Faulkner ate his chips. He said nothing. He did not correct it. The overall lesson. Reputation is not what you did. It is what you did, passed through the people who were watching, inflated 1 degree at each hand, assembled over time into a shape that is larger than the original and built from every single piece of it. You can spend your whole career correcting the record. Or you can put your arm out when someone slips on the ice, read the map when someone else panics, help an old woman pick up her digestive biscuits, and trust that the people around you will do the rest. They will always do the rest. They cannot help it. Neither in the end could Dennis.